Wikipedia is arguably one of the most useful resources on the internet. It's a free encyclopedia that has an article on just about any topic. Today we're going to take a look at some of the most disturbing Wikipedia articles, including a gory revival experiment, a murderous Mormon cult, and a woman who was responsible for the trafficking of over 5,000 children. Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can become a Ko-fi member or a channel member to gain access to uncut videos and other perks, or you can leave me a tip by clicking the thanks under this video. Thanks to anyone who considers this. As you probably guessed from the intro, this video will cover a range of topics that some might find triggering, including murder, trafficking, and experiments involving animals. Viewer discretion is advised. You can click the link in the description to become a Ko-fi member and watch an uncut and ad-free version of this video, which features extra details and a whole extra entry that was unsuitable for this cut. The name Georgia Tann might not be familiar to you, as it wasn't to me, but this woman is actually responsible for the deaths of over 500 children, as well as the kidnapping and trafficking of over 5,000. In fact, in the 1930s, the city of Memphis in Tennessee had the highest infant mortality rate in the nation, and this was mostly due to Georgia's actions. Georgia was born in July 1891 in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and from the off seemed to want to pursue a different path than what was expected of her as a woman at the time. She didn't seem interested in marriage or having her own children. Her father wanted her to become a concert pianist and had her take piano lessons from the age of 5, and although she continued these lessons into adulthood and graduated college with a degree in music in 1913, she was never really interested in that and really wanted to be a lawyer like her father. She passed the state bar exam in Mississippi, but her father didn't want her to become a lawyer because it wasn't seen as a woman's job at the time. Accepting defeat, she took courses in social work and decided to become a social worker, as it was one of the few careers that was acceptable for unmarried women. Georgia eventually started working as the receiving director at the Mississippi Children's Home Society, and here she became close with Ann Atwood, the daughter of a family friend. Ann was 8 years younger than Georgia and had recently given birth to a son out of wedlock who she named Jack. Around this time, Georgia adopted an infant girl who she named June, though she allegedly didn't treat her well at all. Although June had plenty of material gifts, she was never given much attention, and Georgia's attitude towards her has been described as cold. In 1924, Georgia was sacked from the children's home due to questionable methods of arranging adoptions, and shortly after, she moved to Memphis with Ann and Jack. It's believed the two women were romantically involved by this time. Georgia soon found employment as the executive secretary at a branch of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, and it didn't take long for her to take over the organization, apparently through aggressive tactics. This is where her evil crimes started. Georgia believed that low-income families were not able to properly care for children, and that they should instead be placed with what she called people of the higher type. So she used a variety of tactics to coerce birth parents, mostly poor single mothers, to give up their children and allow her to put them up for adoption. She would pressure them, threaten legal action, and sometimes convince them to hand over their babies temporarily, under the guise that they would be returned, when in actuality they'd be taken permanently, most likely never to be seen again. In many of these cases, Georgia lied and told the mothers that their newborn babies needed urgent medical care, even though they were actually born healthy. When the mothers asked about their children, Georgia would tell them they had died, though she'd actually kidnapped them and put them into foster homes or sold them to be adopted. There were also cases where single mothers would drop their children off at nursery, and when they returned to pick them up, they were told social services had taken the children into care. Sometimes parents would voluntarily leave their children in an orphanage temporarily because they were ill or unemployed, and when their situation improved and they were able to take care of them again, they'd return, only to be told that the children had been adopted, or even that the orphanage had no record of them ever being there, so they were effectively missing. Families of these missing children would attempt to locate them, but this proved almost impossible, because Georgia destroyed their records, created fake records to show the adoptive parents, and kept no records of the parents the children had been adopted by. And she made next to no effort to ensure the children were going to a good home. As long as she was getting paid, she didn't care about their safety or well-being. Many of the children taken by Georgia were placed with abusive families, including pedophiles, or used as child labour on farms. And these kind of parents obviously didn't care where the children had come from, but when those who wanted to adopt a child for genuine reasons noticed suspicious details with the child's records, some would question it, and they'd be silenced by Georgia and her accomplices with threats of legal action. She had connections in various places that helped her pull all this off, including the mayor of Memphis, E.H. Crump, who had been known to accept bribes from brothels, gambling halls, and other illegal businesses, and a family court judge named Camille Kelly, who backed Georgia up when she wrongfully threatened parents with legal action. She also had connections that would arrange for her to take babies who were born in prison and psychiatric facilities, as well as those born in homes for unwed mothers, and despite commitments to allow the babies to stay with their mothers for at least 3 months so they could breastfeed, she would often take them within weeks, falsely claiming she had been ordered to do so by the court. The law in Tennessee banned agencies from selling children, but allowed them to charge for their services, and so Georgia's society would typically charge around $7 per adoption, which was a reasonable amount at the time. However, determined to make a significant profit from her work, she began arranging private, out-of-state adoptions, mostly in California and New York, in which she'd charge between $750 and $5,000 a time, which would be up to $80,000 in 2024. Some have estimated that Georgia and her accomplices made the equivalent of up to $16 million in 2024 throughout their years of trafficking children. Before adoption, when the children were in Georgia's care, she allegedly abused and neglected them. According to the Wikipedia article, quote, "With no housing facilities, the society held children awaiting placement in public facilities and foster homes. In the 1930s, Memphis had the highest infant mortality rate in the nation, mainly due to Tann. In 1943, a wealthy businessman donated the mansion at 1556 Poplar Avenue to the society. The offices and intake rooms were put on the bottom floor, while the nurseries were upstairs. The all-female staff wore all-white nursing uniforms, even though they were mostly untrained and even substance abusers. The children were frequently sedated, and those who were challenging to place were allowed to die of malnutrition. Tann regularly ignored doctors' recommendations for sick children, denying them care or medicine, which often led to preventable deaths from illnesses such as diarrhea. While some of her victims are known to be buried in Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, other children were never accounted for. The exact number of deceased children remains unknown, with estimates of about 500 deaths due to mistreatment. While the children were in her care, there were also reports of physical abuse and SA by Georgia, as well as even outright murder. The entire operation went on for over 25 years until September 1950, when reports that Georgia's agency was selling children resulted in an official investigation being launched. The Tennessee Children's Home Society was closed shortly after. The most infuriating part about this is that the investigation has started too late, as just 3 days before, Georgia had died from uterine cancer at the age of 59, having never faced any consequences for her abhorrent crimes. At the time of her death, she was still living with Ann Atwood. In fact, she had actually adopted Ann a few years prior, which was a somewhat common practice among same-sex couples to ensure their partners would inherit their property. Following the investigation, the state of Tennessee sued Georgia's estate for $500,000, the equivalent of about $6.5 million today, but the case was settled out of court and around 2/3 of her $82,000 estate was given up. In 1979, a bill was passed requiring the state to help siblings who had been victims of Georgia and the Tennessee Children's Home Society to find each other, and in 1996, this was extended to include any living birth parents. I guess that's the only silver lining in the aftermath of all this, but unfortunately, the majority of parents who had their children stolen from them would never have been reunited, and many died believing their children were dead, or at least having no way of knowing either way. Another unfortunate part of this story is the fact that the effects of Georgia's actions can still be seen today in the adoption system. Before her, adoption was very uncommon in the US, and because she targeted wealthy and even famous couples to become adoptive parents, she managed to remove a lot of the stigma surrounding adoption, almost making it a new trend. Now, in some ways, that's not a bad thing. Many more children who were placed into care now have families because of this reduced stigma, but I'd argue there were much better ways to go about this, without the mistreatment and deaths of so many innocent children. There's also something that just doesn't sit right with me about these children only being adopted more after all this, because Georgia had marketed them as blank slates that could easily be moulded into whatever the adoptive parents wanted. Not to mention the idea that only wealthy parents should be given the chance to adopt. While I totally believe that children should have some level of financial stability, it's more important that they have loving parents rather than super wealthy parents. Georgia's legacy continues to negatively affect the adoption process in various ways. For example, NewHopeInvestigations.com highlights, quote, "Very unfortunately for adoptees even still today, Georgia Tann made it common practice to falsify adoptees' birth certificates to reflect incorrect information. She did this to cover her own tracks and mask her sinister crimes. Legislators were all too eager to approve this practice with the supposed intent of sparing adoptees the stigma of illegitimacy. In all reality, many of those legislators turned their heads the other way because they themselves had adopted children through Georgia Tann. Still today, all 50 states issue an original birth certificate to adoptees, as well as an amended birth certificate that reflects the adoptive parents as the birth parents. The original certificate is typically then sealed forever, unable to be accessed even by the adoptee him or herself. As of this writing, few states allow adoptees unfettered access to their original birth certificate. Imagine not knowing your biological history or makeup, your ethnicity or medical history. Some adoptees have zero knowledge about themselves, others have only bits and pieces. Still, others have been fed misinformation that they have held to for years, only to discover that the information they were given, their very identities, were completely fabricated. A Wikipedia article titled "Experiments in the Revival of Organisms" describes a 1940 documentary with the same title that documents alleged Soviet research into the resuscitation of dead organisms. For the purpose of this video, I watched the English version of this documentary, and let me warn you before you search for it, it's absolutely horrific, especially if you're particularly sensitive to animal suffering as I am. It's actually embedded in the Wikipedia article, so if you decide to check out the page, be aware of that. Anyway, the grain and flickering of the film gives it an eerie vibe from the off. It begins with Professor J.B.S. Haldane, a British scientist, claiming to have seen some of the experiments in the film carried out in person. The footage of the first couple of experiments isn't too disturbing and is actually pretty fascinating. The first shows a heart that has been removed from a dead dog, beating again in artificial conditions, the same as it would if it was still inside a living organism. The second shows lungs being inflated with air, which is probably close to something you've seen in biology class in school, though here, deoxygenated venous blood is being pumped into the lungs, and it becomes oxygenated arterial blood. Haldane then goes on to describe an experiment in which the decapitated head of a dog can be effectively resuscitated with a venous and arterial pump. This is illustrated with a diagram at first, but then footage of the actual experiment with a real dog's head is shown, and you can see that it reacts to stimuli, blinking when it's prodded in the eye and flinching when tickled with a feather. The researcher then applies citric acid around the dog's nose and mouth, and the dog licks the area with its tongue. I don't know if the dog is consciously aware of what's happening, or if these are just reflex reactions. I'd be inclined to guess that it is consciously aware to some extent, but forgive me for not wanting to research this further and find out for sure. I'd rather try to convince myself that it isn't suffering as much as it looks to be. After the success in reviving isolated organs and an entire head, the scientists decided to attempt to revive a whole organism using a heart-lung device named the autojector. A dog is used again in this experiment, and Haldane clarified that it's under anaesthesia, so doesn't feel any pain. I really hope that means it has no awareness of what's going on too, but I doubt it. The researchers begin by draining the dog's blood, which stops its heart and breathing, and it's soon pronounced dead. They then attach the autojector, and 10 minutes after the dog died, they turn on the device. The artificial circulation causes the heart to start beating again and respiration to continue, as if nothing happened. Suddenly, the once dead dog moves its face and starts reacting to touch again. The autojector is turned off and disconnected, and the dog's heart and lungs continue working as normal. Although the dog is weak and unable to move much for some time after the anaesthesia wears off, 10 to 12 days after the experiment, it returned to its normal state, moving and eating. You'd never know it had been pronounced dead for 10 minutes. Haldane explained that dogs can live for years after the experiment with no harmful effects, growing, putting on weight, and even having families. Multiple dogs had been observed for years after going through the experiments, and 3 were shown in the video. All appeared happy and healthy, and one was the revived offspring of 2 dogs who had also been resuscitated using the same method. As someone who is interested in biology, the results of these experiments are honestly fascinating, but seeing actual footage of them in the documentary was incredibly eerie and kinda hard to watch. The experiments were done by Sergei Brukhonenko, who demonstrated the revived dog's head in front of the Second Congress of Russian Pathologists in Moscow in 1925. The original Russian documentary was released in 1940 and later narrated by Haldane for English-speaking audiences. He was also asked to provide commentary for 2 more Soviet documentary films, though strangely, these now appear to be lost media, and only the documentary I described is currently available online. When the film was shown to an audience in London in late 1942, many were amazed by the results of the experiment, and Bernard Shaw, an Irish critic, wrote about the film, quote, "I'm even tempted to have my own head cut off so that I can continue to dictate plays and books without being bothered by illness, without having to dress and undress, without having to eat, without having anything else to do other than produce masterpieces of dramatic art and literature. Not everyone was quite so enthralled though. Although the experiments described in the documentary are generally believed to have occurred, some aren't convinced that the footage shown is real. According to the Wikipedia article, quote, "The legitimacy of the film is controversial, with some commentators suggesting it is a recreation of the actual experiments, which were more modest. According to some scientists who claim to have seen the experiments in the film, the severed dog head only survived for a few minutes when attached to the artificial heart, as opposed to the hours claimed in the film. Another source of skepticism are the dogs drained of blood and then brought back to life, as after 10 minutes of death, they should have experienced serious brain damage. According to the Institute's records, the dogs only survived for a few days, not several years as the film claimed." It's hard to tell whether the results claimed in the documentary are exaggerated or not. The footage is likely of the real experiments, but it's all short clips stitched together rather than one continuous shot, so who knows if the supposed revived dog is the same one that died, or if the clips were rearranged to make it look like the dog had been revived, when in actuality the before and after clips were all shot before the dog died. Regardless, Sergey's research has been credited as contributing to breakthroughs in the field of artificial life support and organ transplanting, and after his death, he was awarded the prestigious Lenin Prize. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a Mormon religious denomination that follows 4 scriptural texts: the Holy Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price. The church once allowed polygamy, though in 1890 it abandoned the practice and excommunicated some polygamous Mormons. One was a man named LeBaron, who moved to Mexico in 1924 with his 2 wives and 8 children. Alma formed a farming community in Chihuahua, and it was taken over by his son Joel when he died in 1951. Joel eventually moved the community to Salt Lake City in Utah and renamed it the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times. That's a mouthful. Anyway, the group consisted of around 30 families living in Utah and the Baja California Peninsula. In 1972, there was a falling out between Joel and his younger brother Ervil, who was his second in command, and this led to Ervil starting his own sect in San Diego, which he named the Church of the Firstborn of the Lamb of God. The disagreement between the brothers turned into a full-blown rivalry and ended with Ervil ordering Joel's murder in Mexico. Their youngest brother, Verlan, took over Joel's church, and Ervil tried to have him murdered too multiple times over the next decade. Ervil was known to have married at least 13 different women and fathered over 50 children, as well as a number of stepchildren. Many of his wives were underage when they married him. In 1974, Ervil was convicted for Joel's murder, but it was overturned on a technicality that some suspected involved a bribe, and Ervil was a free man once again. Over the next few years, Ervil ordered the murders of various other people, including rival polygamous leaders Bob Simons in 1975 and Rulon C. Allred in 1977. He also ordered the murders of many of his own family members and the families of his supporters who weren't supporters themselves. He is not believed to have killed anyone himself, instead getting his followers and even his wives and stepchildren to do his dirty work. His 13th wife, Rena Chinnerworth, was tried and acquitted for the murder of Rulon Allred, though later confessed to the crime in a memoir she published in 1990, in which she also implicated one of Ervil's stepdaughters, Ramona Marston. Ervil's 10th wife, Vonda White, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Dean Vest, a supporter of Ervil's who had attempted to leave the church. Ervil even allegedly ordered the murder of his own daughter, 17-year-old Rebecca, who was pregnant with her second child at the time and was hoping to leave the church after she gave birth. Sadly, she never made it that far, and is believed to have been strangled by Ervil's stepson Eddie Marston and Dwayne Chenoweth, brother of Rena, Ervil's 13th wife. Ervil believed in blood atonement, which is a doctrine in the history of Mormonism that most groups have since abandoned, though it is still practiced by some splinter groups. It centers around the belief that when Jesus died for our sins, this did not include eternal sins, which are sins that will not be forgiven by God, such as blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. According to this Mormon belief, the only way to atone for an eternal sin is by being killed in a way that allows your blood to run on the ground as a sacrificial offering. Ervil used the doctrine of blood atonement to justify the murders he ordered, but no one really knows if he genuinely believed in the teachings of the practice or if he just used it as an excuse to convince his supporters to wipe out his rivals. On the 1st of June 1979, police in Mexico caught Ervil and he was extradited to the US, where he was convicted for his involvement in Rulon Alred's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, though his crimes didn't end there. While in prison, he wrote a 400-page Bible that he titled The Book of the New Covenants, and one of the commandments was to kill disobedient church members. He included the names of various followers he claimed had betrayed the church and should be punished by death, or perhaps redeemed by blood atonement. At 4 p.m. on the 27th of June 1988, 4 different people were killed separately in what has since become known as the 4 o'clock murders. Dwayne Chenoweth, who allegedly followed orders and murdered Ervil's 17-year-old daughter, was shot and killed with his 8-year-old daughter while running errands after apparently abandoning the church. Honestly, I can't say I have much empathy for Dwayne himself, given that he allegedly killed a pregnant 17-year-old, but to murder his innocent 8-year-old daughter as well is absolutely appalling. Eddie Marston, Ervil's stepson, who had also allegedly been involved in Rebecca's murder, was shot outside too. Mark Chenoweth, also a relative of Ervil's wife Rena, was shot multiple times in his office. 7 people were involved in these murders, most of whom were Ervil's family members, and 5 of the suspects were convicted. It took until May 2010 for the final suspect, Jacqueline LeBaron, to be apprehended by the FBI, and she spent less than 5 years in prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy to obstruct religious beliefs. Ervil reportedly took his own life on the 16th of August 1981, just a year after he had been sentenced to life in prison. The total number of people he ordered to be murdered is not known for sure. It's estimated that his prison kill list resulted in more than 25 murders, and that's not including however many people he had killed before he went to prison. Although he died over 40 years ago, he still has some followers around today, and many of his family members and ex-followers are reportedly in hiding, afraid their lives are still in danger. Most of the information covered here comes from the Wikipedia page on Ervil LeBaron, as well as some of the linked pages. There are also articles on other members of the LeBaron family, the Church of the Firstborn, and various other relevant topics that are all pretty interesting, so I'd recommend checking those out if you want to know more. I also wanted to briefly cover another article titled LeBaron and Langford Families Massacre. The massacre occurred in November 2019 with members of the La Mora Mormon community, which is home to residents from the Church of the Firstborn, as well as mainstream Latter-day Saints and independent fundamentalist Mormons. The Lamora community reportedly had ties with Los Salazar, the cartel group that currently dominate the area, and on the 4th of November, members of a rival group, La Linea, were suspected of murdering 9 people from the community. It's thought they were aiming to disrupt Los Salazar's infiltration into Chihuahua, rather than actually targeting the residents. The victims, most of whom were children, and some relatives of Ervil LeBaron, were killed after gunmen opened fire on a 3-car convoy transporting residents to a wedding, with some dying from gunshot wounds and others burning alive in a car. The victims were 30-year-old Maria Miller, whose maiden name was LeBaron, 43-year-old Donna Ray Langford, 29-year-old Christina Langford, 12-year-old Howard Miller, 11-year-old Trevor Langford, 2-year-old Rogan Langford, and 8-month-old twins Titus and Tiana Miller. 6 others, including 5 children, were injured but survived the attack. Several suspects have been arrested in connection with the massacre, but it doesn't sound like anyone has actually been convicted. Julian LeBaron, whose brother Benjamin was also killed by cartel gunmen in 2009, told the New York Times that police in the area work with the criminals and participate in the murder of women and children, possibly suggesting that those responsible would not face any consequences. The final article we're going to cover is titled 1965 Hendek Bus Accident. The page is pretty short, so I'll just read from that and then discuss some more details from other sources after. Early morning, August 11th, 1965, around 3:15, the passenger bus Sinemala Jivan, operated by Jivan Tourism and driven by Özdemir Suer, was travelling on the D100 highway from Istanbul to Ankara. Near the village of Kagalohan Baba, the bus collided with a truck carrying nitric acid, which was waiting on the roadside due to a shaft malfunction. The truck was being operated by Mustafa Filik. As a result of the accident, the nitric acid in the truck's tanker spilled onto the ground and into a puddle by the roadside. The intense fumes created by the reaction of nitric acid with water caused panic among some of the passengers who were sleeping inside the bus. They thought the bus was on fire and attempted to evacuate in a state of distress. However, when they left the bus, their feet came into contact with the spilled nitric acid on the ground, causing them to suffer burns. In an attempt to alleviate the pain, they entered a mixture of water and nitric acid, resulting in 18 of them dying on the scene. 7 passengers, including the truck's driver Mustafa Falik, were severely injured and later died at Adapazaro State Hospital. Among the casualties, there were 17 individuals who sustained injuries, including citizens from the United States and Lebanon, as well as the bus driver Özdemir Suer. The incident was initially responded to by residents of Kagalohan Baba village and soldiers from the 476th Light Transportation Battalion stationed in Hendek. After the accident, the bodies of the 18 passengers who entered the nitric acid were burned in a pit dug by villagers 10 metres from the accident site. The funeral ceremony and prayers were conducted by the village imam at the location of the pit. The relatives of the victims erected a memorial tomb named the Traffic Martyrs Memorial Cemetery at the location of the pit where the bodies were laid. Of course, this accident, as described by Wikipedia, is absolutely tragic, but some of the sources it references include some much more horrifying details. According to tahaber.com, which has photos of the original newspaper records, and a couple of other sources I found, there was smoke coming off the pool of chemicals on the ground outside and seeping into the bus, so thick that passengers couldn't see each other, hence they thought the bus was on fire. When they jumped out of the bus, they stood in the acid, which immediately began burning their feet, and when they saw a puddle of water, they threw themselves into that, hoping it would rinse off the acid and relieve their pain, only it wasn't just water, it also had acid mixed in. Quote, 23 passengers started to melt one by one in that pit they thought was water. Many had burns dotted all over their bodies, and more skin was being eaten away by the acid the longer it stayed there. Apparently the burning could be smelled from 2 kilometers away, and even the bones of the passengers started dissolving. By the end of the ordeal, there wasn't much left of the bodies. The truck driver, Mustafa, suffered with excruciating burns for 6 hours before he finally died. Many who managed to survive were left with severe scars, and some even lost their eyes. One patient said at the hospital that they couldn't stand the pain. It was so bad that they wanted the paramedics to kill them. This has to be one of the worst ways you could die. I can't even imagine how painful it'd be for your flesh and bones to dissolve. I imagine the fumes from the acid would get into their lungs and start burning them from the inside too. Sadly, this accident and the victims who died in it seem to have been mostly forgotten about. Beyond the Wikipedia page and a couple of other articles, there's barely any information about it online. Let's hope such a terrible accident never happens again. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments, plus any suggestions you might have for a future video. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my Ko-fi members and channel members whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time in a new video.